Welcome to Long History Short, where we discuss the historical context needed to understand today's global politics. I'm your host, Brian Stahl. Beginning in August of 2025, the United States began Operation Southern Spear, a military buildup in the southern Caribbean Sea. Tension between the U.S. and Venezuela increased after the U.S. Navy destroyed several Venezuelan ships that were said to be smuggling drugs. As diplomatic relations broke down, the United States enacted a blockade of Venezuela and boarded several oil tankers departing from the country. The situation escalated dramatically on January 3rd when U.S. forces infiltrated the Venezuelan capital, captured President Nicolas Maduro, and transported him back to the United States. What will happen next in Venezuela is anyone's guess, but to have any idea where this country's future is headed, first we need to understand its past. Let's get started. Joining us today is Professor David Mares. Professor Mares received his PhD from Harvard in 1982, and he is Professor Emeritus at the University of California, San Diego. He is the author of multiple books on Latin American politics, and he is currently working on a book titled Resource Nationalism and the Political Economy of Energy Policy, Venezuela in Context. Welcome, Professor.
Oh, thank you. Just one short correction. That book was published already. It was published in 2022 by Columbia
Ah,
University.
thank you for the corrective. All right. That means all my listeners out there go out and get yourself a copy. So, beginning in 1973, there was an oil crisis after Middle Eastern countries radically decreased the amount of oil they would ship to countries that had allied with Israel during the Yom Kippur War. This led to a huge spike in oil prices worldwide, which my understanding is that caused an economic boom in Venezuela. What impact did that have on the country?
Well, every boom has pluses and minuses. If we look at the pluses, well, with the oil boom in the 70s, suddenly there's even more money than they could possibly have ever imagined. And we have to remember that since the 1940s, Venezuela had been getting half of the oil wealth, right? The country had been getting half. So we're not talking about Venezuela was an oil country like Nigeria or like you name the typical oil country where the elite get all the benefits and the poor people get nothing, right? That wasn't Venezuela. So when the oil boom hits and you have this huge influx of new money, it's not that the people at the bottom suddenly said, wow, now we can have what we need. No, it's people at the top said, wow, we have so much money. Now we can solve all of our shortcomings. So, why move slowly on a project? We can do anything we want because we have a ton of money and we can always expect. This is what happened with the 73 boom. People thought this was permanent. It's always going to be there. So they had not only got a lot of money from exports of oil, they borrowed a lot of money because lots of banks were willing to lend them a lot of money, figuring, well, hey, if the oil money is going to be there forever, they'll repay their loans, right? And so there was this dramatic increase in expenditures after 73 that proved to be unsustainable once oil prices fell, because oil prices were high because it was a temporary moment in the market. But markets are real and markets do respond. And what we saw after 73, it was actually a very brief period of very high prices. By the end of the 1970s, oil prices were coming down and they collapsed in the 80s. So within 10 years, they collapsed. Why? One, because recession in the US and in Europe and in Japan, because of high oil prices, meant that demand went down. Well, demand goes down. What does that mean for prices? Prices are going to start to go down, right? Not only did demand go down, but when prices were that high, people began exploring in places where they figured there was oil, but it was expensive to get it out. So what does that mean? It means supply of oil began to go up. All right. Not only did supply of oil begin to go up, but then people began to experiment with alternative ways of generating energy besides burning oil. Okay. So natural gas became a more important fuel. Okay, not only natural gas, but then people began doing other things, the more nuclear energy projects. So suddenly, this moment in which oil was king disappeared, and Venezuela was left holding the bag because they had told their people, we'll solve all the problems, right? So the people got used to, well, we're rich. We have all this oil and it's worth a lot of money. And people don't understand markets. They understand we had a lot of money. Why don't we have it now? So they start to look for, who's to blame. When oil prices collapsed, when the debt had to be repaid with money that they didn't have, the country fell into an economic crisis. And the elite didn't want to cut back on their benefits. The elite of the both parties, Acción Democrática and COPE, said, well, we'll tighten the belt on the country, but not on us. That meant the middle class and the people at the bottom. So what was their response? It was, the parties really don't represent us anymore. So they began to move away from the parties. And things got really bad in 1989. There was this massive demonstration in the city of Caracas, the capital, and it's known as the Caracazo because the government responded with military force against the demonstrators. And that really got people thinking about, well, who does this government represent? So by the early 1990s, just after that 89 Caracazo, the democratic system was in severe crisis. And that's where we can get into Hugo Chavez in the 92 coup.
Can you tell us a little bit about him? Who was Hugo Chavez?
Okay. Well, Chavez was a colonel in the military. He was always a nationalist and he was always on the left. Okay. Now, Venezuela had small guerrilla groups in the 1960s. All right. And into the 1970s. So there were always these people on the left who said, we're the next Cuba. We're going to have communist revolution in our country. We're going to be socialist. You know, there weren't very many of them. Most Venezuelans didn't want to follow in Cuba's path. All right. It's not that the CIA stopped them. Most Venezuelans didn't want them, so they couldn't get a foothold. All right. So in the 1980s, Hugo Chavez, as a colonel, is among a small group of military officers who are thinking along these lines that, the country is not doing well in the way that we would like to see it doing. We want more distribution. We don't believe in capitalism. We believe in a government-led economy that is for the benefit of the people. And then you got the Caracazo in 89. All right. And that really radicalizes people who had already been moving in this direction. And they say, look, the system is corrupt. The parties don't represent the people anymore. People are being shot on the streets. This is not acceptable. And so Chavez and their three other colonels with him in this initial group, they began to plot a way to get rid of this collapsing democratic system. System is already losing legitimacy. All right. So they begin to plot and how you can overthrow that. There had been, before Chavez's coup in 92, there had been another coup attempted by a general, which was very bloody. All right. And the government was able to put it down. And then shortly thereafter, Chavez did his coup, which was not as bloody as the general's coup. Okay. And the government was able to put down both coups, put down the bloody general's coup, and it put down Chavez's coup. All right. And Chavez was tried and convicted of trying to carry out a military coup against the democratically elected government of Venezuela, and he was sentenced to prison. So nothing particularly surprising there. He does give a speech. He does have his advisors who are very well schooled in Cuban history. And so his speech is very much modeled on Castro's speech in the early 1950s when his attempted coup fails and he's caught and sentenced to prison. And delivers a speech known as "History Will Absolve Me." Okay, so Chavez gives that kind of a speech when he's tried and convicted and sentenced. All right. Now, the other thing you have to understand Chavez, you've got to understand what's going on in Venezuelan democratic politics in the 90s. Right? So the political parties, COPE and Acción Democrática, are becoming delegitimized. So new parties are coming up. They're democratic parties, but they're new parties. Okay. So there are 3 or 4 new parties in 1991, 1992. They're given a boost by the 2 attempted coups, because those attempted coups are signals to the Venezuelan electorate that the parties are weak and they're losing control. All right. So we need to look for new parties. And one of the leaders in the early 1990s is Caldera, Hector Caldera. He was president of Venezuela under the COPE banner. Okay, so he won the presidency as the candidate of COPE. All right. He wants to run for president again in 1992, but COPE doesn't want him to be the candidate. All right. So notice, he's the founder of COPE. He was president under COPE, but the party doesn't want him to be the new candidate, the candidate in 92. They don't think he can win. Right. So he founds his own party. He creates a new party to compete against COPE and against the candidate at COPE. All right. And to get popularity with his new party, he begins to court Chavez, because Chavez has a following because of the coup. Not a massive following, but he has a following. All right. So to demonstrate his anti-systemic credentials, Caldera says, if I'm elected president, I will pardon Hugo Chavez. Chavez and the rest of the others who were sentenced. So he puts the final nail in the coffin of Venezuelan democracy, one of the founders of its democracy. Puts the final nail in by creating this alternative party, because he can't be the president of this party. All right. It shows you just how focused on themselves the elite had become in Venezuelan democracy. Instead of thinking about how can a political party regain its legitimacy and strengthen democracy, they're thinking about how can I keep my place. So let me start a new party, and I'll start a new party by pardoning the guy who tried to overthrow the democracy. It's not that Chavez said, let's have a coup against these and call new elections. No, these were radicals. When they carried out their 92 coup, it wasn't to build a new democracy. It's to build a whole different kind of political system. All right. But Caldera pardons them. All right. In the middle of the 1990s, Venezuela started to produce more oil. All right. And prices were down. They start to recover a little bit, but more importantly, volume starts to go up so they can export more. All right. So in the middle of the 1990s, you get this economic recovery in GDP, okay, in the national economy for Venezuela, but it doesn't trickle down. Okay. The elite, a party elite, okay, including the new parties, they're the people who are benefiting from the rising production of oil. In what is it, 1997 or 98, the CEO of PDVSA is chosen as oil executive of the world by the big international oil lobby. Okay. So he's feted as the oil executive of the world for that year. Well, in that year, 2/3 of Venezuelans are living in poverty. This is a collapse of the Venezuelan middle class. And he's seen as a great man. Okay. Why? Because oil is being produced once again in Venezuela at higher numbers. So in that context, the political parties, even the new political parties, have now lost all credibility. Okay. So in that context, in 1998, a free and fair democratic election, Hugo Chavez is elected president. He's elected president by a good margin. He wins easily a free and fair election. So he becomes president in 1998. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when Chavez carried out his coup in 92, it wasn't in favor of democracy. So when Chavez becomes president in 1998, he's not thinking of how can we strengthen democracy. No, he's thinking about, well, now I'm elected president. Okay, so now I've got these things. How can I strengthen the ability of my government to do what I want? All right, what I think is the right thing to do. Not I, Hugo Chavez, for the benefit of Hugo Chavez, but my vision of Venezuela, which was never a democratic vision. All right, but he still has a vision for Venezuela and how people would benefit from that vision. Okay, it's just not via a democratic path. So in 1990, he begins a process of changing the institutions within Venezuela so that he would have more control over those institutions. So a new parliament is created, a new constitution is developed. Okay, there's still elections. There's he has a supermajority in the new parliament, so he can pass all of these laws. All right. And then in 2000, he's worried that he's not going to have a super majority. So he gets his Congress, before they can lose their super majority, to pass a law that says the president can pass laws without Congress having to approve them. Okay. Why? Because Congress may not approve them in the future. Right. So here's the law. Right. And that leads up to, in 2002, Chavez is talking about 49 laws that he wants, and he's going to implement them without congressional approval and everything else. And you begin to get the extreme polarization in Venezuela. I mean, I would say that Venezuela wasn't polarized before 2002. Chavez wins, yes, but it wasn't a polarized country yet. But starting in 2002, the country increasingly gets polarized. Chavez can win an election, but he can't implement what he wants without more control over the government. So he can win a democratic election, but he wants a government that he can control. And you can't do that under a democracy. Okay, you see that in, lots of places around the world. Today, there's a lot of discussion about the weakening of democracy worldwide, okay, through democratic elections. Why? Because around the world, in lots of different countries, people are electing a president, and then the president they elect, or the prime minister through the parties that they elect, the prime minister or the president then begins to dismantle the democratic checks and balances because he's been elected or she's been elected. Okay, so that's what happened with Chavez. He had a vision, he was elected, right? And then he uses that base to then begin to dismantle all of the checks and balances. You can't have a democracy without checks and balances. Doesn't that?
No, you can't, for sure. So in 2006, Chavez gave a famous speech where he referred to George W. Bush as the devil. What happened that caused this deterioration in U.S. Venezuelan relations? Because the two countries had gotten along pretty well historically, and then obviously a gigantic rupture. What happened?
Well, the rupture isn't really 2006. It really starts in 2002. All right. The weakening starts in 2002. And I wouldn't even call it a rupture in 2006 yet. All right. But, when Chavez is elected, it's not clear what he's going to do. He's a relative unknown. You knew he carried out a coup, but he doesn't win the election in 98 saying, I want to carry out another coup, so elect me. All right. So nobody knows what he's going to do. And he talks about working with the private sector. His first couple of years in the presidency, he's got a very pragmatic minister, Giordani, who tells him, look, you got to be very careful with the oil sector. You got to do this, you got to do that. We can't overspend. So people are giving him space to see what is he going to do. And that includes the United States. We don't condemn him in 1998. We don't condemn him in 1999. We don't even condemn him in 2000. All right. But in 2002, he moves against the oil sector. He wants to control the oil company. Why? Because, like in lots of governments, he wants to be in charge of the money that the oil company has. All right. Now, It's not that Chavez says, I want to be a rich man, and so I want to take that money for me. No, I have this vision for Venezuela. So I want to use that money for this vision in Venezuela and for me and for my buddies and for all of those people whose support I need in order to get here. So he's got a big vision, all right? But he needs to control the oil company because that's where the money's coming from. So the oil company had been pretty autonomous of the government, and that was seen in the 1990s as one of the problems. I told you about Justi, the CEO of PDVSA. He could do all of the things that the international oil companies loved because he was independent of the government. All right. So Chavez says we have to control the company. He begins to fire people in the board of directors. He begins to fire the leadership, and the company goes out on strike against him. All right. So then he says, this is a threat to me. Right. So we can't allow this. And there's a big strike, big strike. And ultimately, it's resolved. All right. And then he's got these 49 laws he wants to pass without congressional approval because he's got, this enabling law from 2000 that says he can do anything he wants. And so the businesses now want to go out on strike, the private sector businesses, and there's a strike in 2002. At the same time, the military high command is beginning to get worried because Chavez is getting friendlier with Cuba and the military is not communist. So the military say, what the heck's going on here? And one of the ways in which Cuba makes friends is by providing it with intelligence services. And so more Cubans are coming to Venezuela to help the Chavez government keep an eye on things. So the military high command's getting worried about that. So you begin to get a number of generals thinking about, well, maybe this is time for a coup, right? So let's get rid of Chavez. Not It's not clear that what they're asking for is a coup to then have a military government as opposed to a coup and then let's get call for elections. All right. And then there's a businessman, the business sector's getting involved with them. And so there is in 2002, there's a coup attempt. All right. And Chavez actually is arrested. And for about 47 hours or so, he's detained. And uh, the the military looks for somebody who can be the face of the coup. And there's this businessman. And so the businessman says, I'm in charge, but he doesn't call for elections. And the US government immediately recognizes the coup. That's the start of the problem in US Venezuelan relations. All right. We are still in favor of democracy in 2002. But then in 2002, we went back on that. So that was the beginning of the end. All right. 2006, when Chavez calls Bush the devil, shortly thereafter, the U.S. and Venezuela are having talks. So a lot of it is rhetoric. A lot of it is what's called these days performance, right? Performance politics. We see a lot of that today. Obama comes in 2008. Obama goes down and sees Chavez, and things are going along not badly. All right. There's tensions, but there isn't a rupture in relations.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Now, in 2013, Hugo Chavez dies and Nicolas Maduro takes over. Can you give us a little bit of background on him?
Okay. Maduro is a very skilled negotiator and politician. He worked his way up. He was a bus driver initially in his career, but he worked his way up through the unions. In the 1990s, there are pictures of him with Chavez. So he's known Chavez. He was an advocate. He was a political activist. He was on the left. He went to Cuba for the various kinds of classes that the Cuban government offers, and left-wing people go to Cuba and take those classes. So he was involved in that. He won a seat in the parliament in the National Assembly in 1998. He then became very close to Chavez, was a supporter of Chavez in the 2002 efforts, and he was president of the National Assembly for a few years. And then in 2006, Chavez selected him to be his foreign minister. So then he was foreign minister to 2012 for that term of Chavez, their 6-year terms. And he traveled the world articulating the Chavista vision of international and domestic politics. So he's very close to Chavez. He was one of a number of people who were very close to Chavez. Okay. Now, when Chavez wins the 2012 election, which was a relatively free election, it's true the government's using a lot of its influence to try and influence votes, but, you know, it's still within the realms of what is democratically acceptable in 2012. So Chavez wins the election in 2012 against the opposition candidate, who's Enrique Capriles, by a good 12 percentage. Capriles says, nah, that's not right, but most of the world recognizes that as maybe 12 wasn't right, but he won the election. Chavez won the election. All right, so Chavez wins the election. Now, why does Chavez win the election in 2012? Because the opposition, a lot of people are getting worried about the growing authoritarianism under Chavez. But the opposition platform into this period is Chavez is the devil. Chavez is evil. Okay? Venezuela was paradise before Chavez. Well, if your country was 2/3 of your people were living in poverty when Chavez was elected, how can that be paradise? Right? So the opposition is just running an anti-Chavez, not a how do we benefit the people of Venezuela campaign. So it's no surprise that Chavez can win a presidential election. So Chavez in 2012 wins by let's call it 10 to 12%. All right, there's a dispute about how much. He hasn't told the people he's dying of cancer. He dies early in 2013. Before he dies, he names Maduro his vice president. All right. Now, I haven't seen a good explanation for why does he choose Maduro rather than the other guys he was really close with. He's really close with the head of the National Oil Company, Ramirez. He's really close with Diosdado Cabello. Um, you know, why does he choose Maduro? I don't know. I don't know anybody who knows. All right. It's not that Maduro was a farce and he chose somebody who wouldn't show him up. Maduro knows how to build coalitions. He demonstrated that in his career. He's not an idiot. So if the president dies under Chavez's constitution, if the president dies early in the term, there have to be new elections for the president. Now, initially, the Chavistas are saying, nah, we don't need an election. All right. But the opposition says, look, it's your own constitution. You got to have elections. And so finally, after a lot of pressure, domestic pressure and international pressure, the Chavistas agree, okay, well, we're going to have elections. So they decide they're going to have elections. Maduro will stand for the elections. And a few months later, there are new elections. Okay. And Capriles, who lost to Chavez by 10 to 12%, is going to be the opposition candidate. And Maduro is going to be the Chavista candidate. Okay. Now, there's a lot of controversy about that 2013 election. Certainly, the government is using all of its resources to make sure that people will vote for Maduro, Chavez's chosen successor. Chavez actually says, he's my chosen successor. Now, we know that this is controversial because whereas Chavez won with 10 to 12% in October of 2012 against Capriles, officially, Maduro wins in March, I guess it's March of 2013, 6 months later, by 1.5%. Okay. Who's controlling the counting? Well, the National Electoral Council is run by the Chavistas. All right. And it was so close, 1.5%. I can't say, and I haven't seen anything where there's definitive proof that it was a problem. All right. But Maduro wins. So we're there with Maduro. He's won an election. He's now the new president. Now we have something else, the 2015 legislative elections. These are the first legislative elections under Maduro as president. What happens in the 2015 elections? The opposition wins a supermajority in the national elections, even with the Chavistas running the National Electoral Council, even with Maduro running the government and using the government's resources to say, let's all vote for the Chavista government. All right. So how do we understand that? Well, Maduro's not Chavez, okay, but the Venezuelan economy is collapsing. Why is the Venezuelan economy collapsing? Not because the U.S. has sanctions. We haven't sanctioned Venezuela yet at that point. It's because, like Venezuela in the 1970s, what did the Chavistas do? They said, oil prices are high. They're going to be high forever. So what can we do? We can solve all of our problems. So what does the Chavista government do? They spend, they spend, they spend, they spend, they spend, they borrow, they borrow, they borrow, they borrow. There's corruption everywhere. Okay. There's paying off the people that whose support you need. So your partisans, even if we don't call that corruption, it's not productive spending. All right. They decide that, well, if this steel company is going out of business because nobody wants to buy the steel, we'll nationalize the steel company and we'll keep the people employed. The people don't work, but they get a salary. Well, where does the money come for the people's salary? Well, it comes from the federal government. Why? Because the steel company is owned by the federal government and we have the money. So we pay the people even though they're not working. We pay them their regular salary. Okay. So the economy collapses. All right. And how do they deal with the collapse? They start printing money. What does that mean? It means inflation. So by 2015, the Venezuelan economy is in shambles. All right. And so the opposition wins the parliamentary elections. All right. So what does Maduro as president do now that he's faced with a National Assembly that has a supermajority of the opposition? He creates an alternative assembly. He takes all power away from the National Assembly and he creates a new assembly. He calls it the People's Congress. All right. And he says, they're the ones. And who runs the People's Congress? All the Chavistas. Right. And I shouldn't say Chavistas because there's an internal tension within the Chavistas. Maduro begins to arrest a number of Chavez people who don't like the way he's running the government. They said Chavez wouldn't have done that. And this isn't good for Chavismo. Maybe good for Maduro, but it's not good for Chavismo. And so he begins to arrest them. And he exiles them and they run away and they go to other countries and they denounce Maduro. He's not really a Chavista, they say. So there's this tension within Chavismo about Maduro. So it's not really accurate to call Maduro a Chavista. What we know is that Maduro is in charge of the machinery that Chavez left, but Chavismo has fractured. So you get that 2015 victory by the opposition in a collapsed economy. The economy continues to collapse. Then there's the 2018 presidential election, and that's outright fraud. I mean, that's outright fraud. And Maduro claims that he won, and the 2024 Maduro claims he won. Outright fraud. I can't say 2013 was, but certainly 2018 was, and certainly 2015 legislative elections weren't fraudulent. And that's why the opposition won, and that's why you can't have free elections in Venezuela because the opposition is going to win.
So, what led to the tensions with the U.S. and Venezuela that eventually prompted our intervention in the country? I don't know what word you want to use. I mean, I don't know if you want to say the kidnapping or the taking. How about this? The arrest of Nicolas Maduro. What led to all that?
Okay. Well, the tension between the U.S. and Venezuela, as I already mentioned, was building up since 2002. All right. But that didn't inevitably lead to, what happened last fall. Okay. It didn't even inevitably lead to the ratcheting up of sanctions, which begins in 2017. The first sanctions on Venezuela were on individual leaders of the Venezuelan government. And they weren't even on Hugo Chavez. They were on people in his government who the U.S. government saw as in charge of the violence against protesters. So the first sanctions by the U.S. government against anybody in Venezuela. We're against a few Venezuelan government officials who the Obama administration said were responsible for the violation of the human rights of the protesters against the Chavez government. When Trump #1 comes in, okay, so 2017 is the first time that the US government actually put sanctions on the country of Venezuela, okay, the government of Venezuela. Before that, it's all on individuals within the government. Okay, 2017 with Trump 1, it's on the government of Venezuela. All right. Trump begins to ratchet up a lot of the rhetoric. There's a lot of explanations within the United States about why he does that. He's got a lot of following in Florida, and there are a lot of Venezuelan elite that fled Venezuela and went to Miami. They're very right-wing people, and they were very anti-Chavez. There were also people who fled because they were being pursued because they had demonstrated. And so they were also articulating an anti-Chavista thing, but Trump 1 isn't paying much attention to them. He's paying much more attention to the elite in Florida, which is saying you got to do something about Venezuela and Chavez and the Chavistas in Venezuela, etc. So he begins to ratchet up the pressure on Venezuela, and the U.S. government recognizes the opposition president of the National Congress that the Venezuelan government is marginalized as the president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, because by the Chavista constitution, if the president is incapacitated, then the president of the National Assembly becomes president. The president and vice president are incapacitated. The president of the National Assembly becomes president. So fraudulent elections in 2018. So there's no president, no vice president. It should be the president of the National Assembly. That was Juan Guaido. All right. So you get that. Now, Biden comes in and he tries to find a way to get back on track with Venezuela. All right. And it's not just the United States, but the international community is trying to find a way that you can negotiate a transition out of an illegitimate government, because by now most countries in the world are seeing the Venezuelan government as illegitimate. Even in Latin America, most of the governments in Latin America see the 2018 presidential election as illegitimate. They disagree about what do you do about it, but they do see it as illegitimate. Okay, only a few governments, Nicaragua, Cuba, see it as a legitimate election. So Biden and the Europeans and some Latin American countries are all trying to find a way in which you can get the Maduro government to agree to a transition to a democratic election and then the recreation of a democratic government in Venezuela. All right. Why? Because Europe, those Latin American countries, the Biden administration, they believe in democracy. All right. They want to get there. All right. Now, Trump 2 comes in, and Trump 2 is very different from Trump 1. Trump 2 has a different vision of Trump 1. We don't know how policy is made in the Trump administration, in the current Trump administration. Okay. So I'm not going to offer an explanation for why the United States wound up sending military forces into Venezuela and capturing, I don't want to call it an arrest, okay, but capturing Maduro. What's happening in Venezuela? A couple of things are happening in Venezuela. There is a sense in Venezuela that Biden tried, and that rejuvenated some hope that there would be a transition. Maduro had said that he would have democratic elections in 2024. All right, so they gave it a let's look and see. Let's give it an opportunity and see what happened. All right, democratic elections didn't happen. Trump comes in and Trump says, well, we'll ratchet up the pressure. All right, so they're figuring, well, the opposition is figuring, well, maybe ratcheting up the pressure is going to work this time. Maria Corina Machado wins the Nobel Peace Prize. So the world is on our side. Here are these opportunities. And then Trump is there, and, Trump begins to put harder pressure on Venezuela. So the opposition is thinking, wow, we're on the road. This is the transition to democracy. It's going to happen for sure this time. There's no way that the Chavista government can stand up to this, right? And, Trump sees that the diplomatic pressure doesn't work. Then he sees that the seizure of those few boats out there doesn't work. And we have to be clear. This isn't about the drug trade. I mean, this is a president who pardoned somebody who the U.S. judicial system had sentenced to jail for being an online system to sell illegal drugs in the United States. He was tried and convicted by the U.S. courts. He was serving time in a U.S. jail. Why? Because he was making it easy for people to buy illegal drugs, billions of dollars over years. All right. And he got caught and he got sentenced to prison. And what does Trump do? He pardoned him. All right. And then there's the Honduran president. He was extradited to the United States. He was in our judicial system. And the Hondurans sent him to us, not under Trump, before Trump. They sent him to us to stand trial for being involved in the illegal drug trade. And what does Trump do? He pardons him. He pardons him and sends him back to Honduras. All right. So bombing those boats in the Caribbean is not about drugs. It's about showing that the United States has the ability to exert military force. So it's a signal to Maduro. Right? That we can be clear about. Maduro, first and foremost, and maybe the rest of the world, but certainly to Maduro. All right. And Maduro begins to think, well, man, maybe this is real. And there are talks going on between the Maduro government and the U.S. But Trump is getting a lot of information that there's weakening support for Maduro within the Venezuelan government. Okay, the military, the civilians. Maduro doesn't have the kind of control over the Venezuelan government that we have. I don't know, and I don't know anybody who's talking who actually knows, but it appears that there was insider information that was provided by people who were opposed to Maduro, whether they were opposed to Maduro because they wanted democracy or they just wanted a different dictator. I don't know. We don't know. But they gave the information that facilitated the ability of the United States to pinpoint this guy, go in and grab him. Under the right conditions, that means having plenty of information and having luck. You got to have luck. You got to have good information, capable people. We have good information. We have capable people. Now, good information and capable people doesn't mean you're always right. Bush had good information, he thought, and he certainly had a capable military, but Iraq was a disaster. All right. And that's what's keeping Trump from ratcheting up the pressure on Venezuela at this point. Okay. It's one thing to get the leader out. It's another thing to go in there and actually take control of the country. So we got Maduro, but Trump makes a deal with his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. Was Delcy Rodriguez the person who gave the information to the U.S.? I don't know. Okay, she's negotiating with the U.S. She plays both ends. She makes deals with the United States, and then she comes out and says, "Oh no, we're not gonna. That's enough. We're not gonna make any more deals." And then she makes another deal. Okay. We have to think of Trump's current policy in Venezuela as having been successful from Trump's particular point of view. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, even from a Trumpian perspective. Can Delcy Rodriguez maintain power in Venezuela? We don't know how the other people who were contenders for power feel about her having been selected the person. They could certainly use against her that she's too easy on Trump because she's looking very easy on Trump. Would they be harder? We just don't know. There are all of these unknowables at this point in Venezuela. But we can say that it's a very interesting time from a historical perspective.
Well, there's no doubt about that. Professor, we are just about out of time. To all my listeners out there, you've now heard the long history short. Make sure you hit like and subscribe. Professor Mares, thank you for your time and your knowledge.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.